The morning Julia Morgan was supposed to become Julia Hargrove, the sky over Redemption Creek, Texas opened up like a wound and bled golden light across the dry red earth, and every last soul in town took it as a sign from God. Every soul except the man who was supposed to be waiting for her at the altar. It was the spring of 1879, and Redemption Creek was the kind of small town that lived up to its name only on Sundays and holidays, when the men put away their whiskey and their gambling debts and pretended for a few hours that they were the upright citizens their mothers had raised them to be. The rest of the week, the town was dust and heat and the low rumble of cattle drives passing through on their way north, leaving behind nothing but the smell of manure and the occasional drunk cowboy sleeping in the middle of Main Street. Julia had grown up in Redemption Creek. She had watched it from the window of her father's dry goods store, had swept its wooden sidewalks and hauled water from its well and knew every crack in every board of every building from the schoolhouse to the saloon. She was 24 years old, with dark hair that curled at her temples when the humidity rose and eyes the color of the creek itself, a deep, shifting green that made men look twice and then pretend they hadn't. She was not a woman who asked for much. She had not been raised to ask for much. Her father, Elias Morgan, had come to Redemption Creek with $17 and a stubborn streak wide enough to build a foundation on. He had built the store up from nothing, had married a quiet woman named Ruth who gave him Julia before a fever took her when Julia was just 7 years old. After that, it had been just the two of them, Elias and Julia, measuring out flour and sugar and nails, keeping careful ledgers and careful lives. When Thomas Hargrove had come courting, Elias had approved. Thomas was the son of the most prosperous rancher in the county. He had blonde hair and a wide smile and a way of walking into a room that made everyone look at him, and for a time Julia had let herself be swept up in the looking. He had promised her a house of her own, children, a life beyond the counter of her father's store. He had promised her things in the way of a man who believes promises cost nothing until the bill comes due. They had been engaged for 8 months. Julia had sewn her wedding dress herself, working late into the evenings with a lamp burning low and her fingers moving with the kind of careful precision she brought to everything. The dress was white muslin with small pearl buttons down the back and lace at the collar that she had ordered special from San Antonio. She had not spent extravagantly. She was not a woman who spent extravagantly, but she had let herself believe, quietly and privately, that she deserved this one beautiful thing. The Church of Redemption Creek sat at the north end of Main Street, a modest white building with a crooked steeple and a bell that always rang slightly off-key. On the morning of April the 12th, 1879, it was filled with every person in town who could squeeze into a pew. Julia's father walked her down the aisle with his jaw set tight and his eyes bright with a pride that made her throat close up, and she held her small bouquet of wildflowers, bluebonnets, and Indian paintbrush, because it was Texas in April and the fields were full of them, and she walked toward the altar where Thomas Hargrove was supposed to be standing. He was not there. Reverend Calhoun stood at the altar with his Bible held against his chest and a look on his face that Julia would later remember as the expression of a man who has swallowed something he cannot bring himself to spit out. The pews murmured. Heads turned. Someone near the back coughed. Julia stopped walking. She stood in the middle of the aisle of that church with her father's arm under her hand and her bouquet beginning to tremble, and looked at the empty space where Thomas Hargrove should have been. And she understood in the way that you understand things that hit you in the chest rather than the mind, sudden and total, and without room for argument, that he was not coming. The murmuring grew louder. She could feel the pity radiating off the pews like heat off sun-baked stone, and it was the pity that steadied her, because Julia Morgan had always been more galvanized by the things she refused to accept than by the things she desired. She drew herself up to her full height, which was not inconsiderable, and she made her face do the thing it had learned to do after her mother died and her father spent 3 months staring at the wall. She made it go still and composed and entirely unreadable. Her father's arm tensed under her hand. "Julia," he said, very low. "I know," she said. She turned around in that aisle with her back straight and her chin level, and she walked back out of that church with every eye in Redemption Creek on her, and she did not let a single one of them see her flinch. Outside, the April sun hit her full in the face, and for a moment she just stood on the church steps and breathed, and the world was very quiet except for the distant lowing of cattle and the sound of a horse blowing air through its nose somewhere nearby. She heard the door open behind her, heard her father come out, heard the soft voices of the congregation beginning to talk. She did not turn around. That was when she heard the footsteps on the road, not the shuffling sound of someone from the congregation coming to offer condolences, but the deliberate, unhurried sound of boots on packed earth, coming from the direction of the livery stable. She turned, not because she meant to, but because something in the quality of those footsteps demanded attention. He was tall. That was the first thing she registered. Tall and lean in the way of a man who had spent years in the saddle and eaten a lot of meals that were more necessity than pleasure. He wore a dark coat over a collarless shirt, trail-worn but clean, and a hat that had seen considerable weather pulled low against the morning sun. He was leading a horse, a big gray with 3 white socks and an intelligent eye, and he had been walking from the direction of the livery when the church doors had opened, and the scene on the steps had apparently brought him to a halt. He was looking at her, not with pity, which she was braced for, and not with the peculiar avid curiosity of people who witness a catastrophe and cannot help feeling grateful it is not their own. He was looking at her the way a person looks at something that surprises them, a combination of assessment and something harder to name, something that was neither intrusive nor dismissive. He was perhaps 28 or 29, she thought. Dark-haired beneath the hat, with a jaw that needed shaving and eyes she could not quite make out the color of from where she stood, but that seemed to be taking in a great deal more than they let on. Behind her, she heard old Margaret Whitfield's voice floating out from inside the church. Poor dear girl, absolutely abandoned, and on her wedding day of all days Thomas Hargrove ought to be ashamed of himself. His father will hear about this. I can promise you that Julia's chin went up another fraction of an inch. The man with the gray horse had not moved. He was still looking at her. And then, without any apparent calculation, he walked toward her, not hurrying, not hesitating, just moving in the steady way of a man who has made a decision and sees no reason to equivocate about it. He stopped at the bottom of the church steps. Up close, she could see his eyes were a warm brown, and there were fine lines at their corners from squinting into the sun, and his expression was serious but not unkind. He pulled his hat off his head with his free hand. The other still held the gray horse's reins, and he held it against his chest. "I couldn't help but see," he said. His voice was low and even, with a quality that made her think he was not a man who spoke often but meant it when he did. "I'm sorry for whatever happened in there." Julia looked at him for a moment. The pity she was braced against was not in his voice. What was in his voice was something more honest than pity, something closer to simple human acknowledgement of a difficult thing. "It appears my intended has decided not to attend his own wedding," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. Something moved in his expression, not quite a smile. "I see, Julia." Her father had come up beside her, his hand on her arm, and he was looking at the stranger with the combination of suspicion and exhaustion that characterized most of Elias Morgan's dealings with unfamiliar men. "He's all right, Papa," Julia said, though she had no real basis for saying so. The stranger looked at her father. "Nathan Lockhart," he said, extending his right hand. He had shifted the horse's reins to his left with the easy familiarity of a man who has done it 1,000 times. "I'm passing through. I don't mean to intrude on a family matter." Elias shook his hand once, looking him over. "Elias Morgan, and this is my daughter Julia." "I know who she is," Nathan Lockhart said. "The whole town knows who she is, from what I can tell." That was true enough. Redemption Creek had approximately 300 souls, and most of them were currently visible through the church windows or clustered near the door, pretending they were not watching everything that was happening on the steps. Julia felt the weight of all those eyes like a physical thing pressing against her back. Nathan Lockhart was looking at her again. He put his hat back on his head, and there was something in the set of his shoulders, a kind of deliberate steadiness, that reminded her, absurdly, of the way her father looked when he had made up his mind about something. "I don't suppose," he said, and his voice was still even, still unhurried, but there was a quality in it now that made her pay closer attention, "that you'd be willing to share the reason you're standing out here instead of in there." It was not what she expected him to say. She had expected something consoling and useless. "I believe I've just been left at the altar," she said. "That's the plain truth of it." "That's a hard thing," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "It is." The door of the church opened wider and Reverend Calhoun appeared on the threshold, his black coat hanging from his thin shoulders, and his expression carrying the weight of a man who has been tasked with saying something meaningful in an unmeaningful situation. Behind him, the congregation had begun to filter out onto the steps and into the churchyard, the women pulling their shawls tighter and the men hooking their thumbs in their suspenders, and everyone talking in the careful, pointed way of people who are making sure their sympathy is noticed. Julia watched them come. She watched the way their eyes cut to her, and then away, and then back again, and she felt the slow, deep burn of humiliation that she had been holding back since the moment she had understood that Thomas was not coming, felt it like a coal lodged in her chest, hot and steady, and requiring a continuous act of will to contain. Nathan Lockhart had turned to watch the congregation emerging. He turned back to her and she saw him take in her expression, all of it, the composure and the effort it was costing, both things visible to anyone looking carefully enough, and he said, very quietly, so that only she and her father could hear him, "You don't have to stand here and let them look at you if you don't want to." "I don't have anywhere else to go," Julia said. The words were out before she could reconsider them, and they were more honest than she had intended to be with a stranger. "This is my town. My father's store is 200 feet down that street. There is nowhere in Redemption Creek that I can go today where this morning doesn't follow me." Nathan Lockhart was quiet for a moment. His gray horse dropped its head and nosed at the dry grass near the church steps, unconcerned with the drama of human affairs. Then Nathan said, "That's a fair point." Reverend Calhoun had reached them. He touched Julia's hand with his dry, bony fingers and said what ministers say, the kind words that are shaped to fit every grief and therefore fit none perfectly. And Julia said the appropriate things back to him, and to the women who came after him, and to the men who shook her father's hand and patted her shoulder with the awkward tenderness of people who do not know what to do with a woman's pain. She said the right things and kept her face composed and did not cry, because crying was for later, when she was alone, and she was not alone yet. Nathan Lockhart did not leave. He stood at the bottom of the church steps with his horse beside him, and he did not offer opinions or additional condolences. He was simply present, the way a fence post is present, solid and unobtrusive, and somehow providing the impression that things would not fall over as long as it was there. When the last of the congregation had finished paying their respects and drifted away in ones and twos, and when Reverend Calhoun had gone back inside to extinguish the candles and put away the flowers that had been arranged in anticipation of a wedding, and when Elias Morgan had gone inside to sit down, because his legs were troubling him the way they always did when he was tired and anxious, Julia found herself standing alone at the top of the church steps with nothing but the April morning around her and the stranger at the bottom of the steps looking up at her. "You're still here," she observed. "I don't have anywhere particular to be by a certain hour," he said. She came down the steps. Standing on the same level as him, she could see that he was taller than she had estimated, 6 feet or close to it, with the straight posture of a man who was used to the outdoors. "Where are you riding to, Mr. Lockhart?" "North," he said. "Eventually. I've been riding circuit for the past year, ranch work wherever I can find it." He paused. "I was going to stop here for supplies and one night at whatever passes for a boarding house." "Mrs. Purcell's place," Julia said automatically. "2 streets over. She keeps a clean room and charges a fair rate." "I appreciate that." She looked at him, he looked at her. The April sun was warm on her shoulders through the white muslin of the dress she had made with her own hands for a morning that had turned out entirely differently than she had imagined. "You must think I'm in a very sorry state," she said. "I think you're in an unfair one," he said. "That's different." It was different. The distinction was so exact and so unexpected that she felt something shift in her chest. Not the grief, which was still there, not the humiliation, which was also still there, but something underneath those things that was harder to name. Something that recognized in his words a way of seeing her that was neither pitying nor dismissive. "Well," she said, and she squared her shoulders and looked down the street toward her father's store. "I should go check on my father. He's been on his feet since 5 this morning." "Of course," Nathan said. He put his hat brim between 2 fingers in the way of a man tipping his hat, though the hat stayed on his head. "Miss Morgan, I hope the rest of your day is considerably kinder to you than the beginning of it." Julia almost smiled at that. Not quite, but almost. "Thank you for not treating me like a spectacle, Mr. Lockhart." "You weren't one," he said simply. She walked down the street to her father's store, and she did not look back, but she heard the quiet sound of his boots on the earth behind her for a few steps before they turned in the direction of the livery stable, and she was, in some way she did not examine too closely, glad that he had been there. She cried that night. Alone in her room with the door closed and the lamp turned low and the wedding dress hung on the back of the door where she had put it when she came in, she sat on the edge of her bed in her plain dress and her hairpins, and she let herself feel the full weight of it. Not just the embarrassment of being left at the altar, though that was considerable. Not just the public nature of it, the whole town watching, the inevitable weeks of talk that would follow. But the deeper thing, the feeling of having been weighed by a person who had told her she was enough, told her with words and with a ring and with 8 months of promises, and then having been found, after all of it, to be not quite worth showing up for. She cried until she was empty, and then she washed her face and braided her hair and went to sleep, and in the morning she got up and went downstairs and opened the store. It was 3 days later when she saw Nathan Lockhart again. She was sweeping the wooden sidewalk in front of the store, a task she did every morning, a task that had the virtue of being both necessary and mindless, when he came around the corner from the direction of Mrs. Purcell's boarding house. He had shaved since she had seen him last. It changed his face somewhat, made it less weathered and more defined, and she found herself noticing this before she had quite decided to look at him carefully. He stopped when he saw her. "Good morning, Miss Morgan." "Good morning, Mr. Lockhart. I thought you'd be on your way north by now." "I delayed a day or 2, he said, which was not quite an explanation. She leaned on her broom. "Mrs. Purcell's cooking is persuasive." "It is," he agreed, with what might have been the beginning of a smile at the corner of his mouth. "That and the gray horse picked up a stone in her shoe, wanted to make sure there was no lameness before I put miles on her. There's no lameness. She's right as rain this morning." He looked at the broom and then at the store. "Your father's dry goods." "Yes. You work it with him." "I run it with him," she corrected, and there was no sharpness in it, just precision. "Have since I was 12. He nodded, as though this told him something he had already suspected. "I need to resupply before I head out," he said. "Beans and salt pork and coffee if you carry it." "We carry it all," she said. "Come in." She showed him the store with the competent ease of someone who knows every inch of their domain, found him his beans and salt pork and coffee, and threw in a recommendation for the dried peaches because they kept well and were worth the small extra cost on a long ride, and he listened to all of it and said at the end, "I'll take the peaches." While she was wrapping his supplies in brown paper and figuring his total in the ledger, her father came in from the back room, and the 2 men introduced themselves properly. Elias had been distracted on the church steps, and Elias, who was a fair judge of people in the way of someone who has extended credit to many men and been wrong only occasionally, looked Nathan Lockhart over and seemed to decide something. "You said you do ranch work," Elias said. "Yes, sir. Break horses, manage cattle, whatever's needed." "There's a ranch 20 miles east," Elias said. "Dawson's Place. He lost 2 hands to the silver mines in Colorado last fall and hasn't replaced them. A man who could handle horses could find steady work there if he wanted it." Nathan Lockhart looked at Elias for a moment and then looked at Julia, and she saw something pass behind his eyes, a brief, careful consideration, and then he looked back at Elias. "I appreciate that," he said. "I'll think on it." He paid for his supplies and he left, and Elias watched him go with an expression Julia knew well, the expression of a man who has planted a seed and is now prepared to wait patiently for whatever comes of it. "Papa," Julia said. "What?" Elias said, all innocence. "Don't. I didn't say anything." "You said plenty," she said, "and it's only been 3 days." "I know how long it's been," her father said, and went back into the storeroom. The talk about Thomas Hargrove had gotten around to Julia the day after the wedding, brought to her in the careful, apologetic manner of someone delivering bad news to a person they respect. Margaret Whitfield, who was, for all her gossip, fundamentally a decent woman, had come into the store on the morning of April 13th and stood on the other side of the counter and said, with the directness of someone who believes truth told gently is still truth, "Julia, I think you ought to know. Thomas Hargrove left for Abilene 2 days before the wedding. Mary Carver saw him boarding the stage. He was with the Delacourt girl from over in Cedar Falls, the younger one, with the money from her grandmother. He didn't tell a living soul in this town he was going." Julia had been entering numbers in the ledger when Margaret said this. She had finished the number she was writing before she looked up. "I see," she had said. "I'm sorry, dear." "Yes," Julia had said. "Thank you, Margaret." She had not been entirely surprised. Looking back, she could see the signs she had not wanted to see. The way Thomas had become evasive in the weeks before the wedding, the excuses for not visiting, the letters that were shorter and less warm than they had been in the beginning. She had attributed it to the ordinary anxiety of a man approaching a large commitment. She had been wrong about what she was attributing it to, but not entirely wrong about the anxiety. What she felt, in the days that followed, was not the wrenching grief of genuine heartbreak. Thomas had been, she understood now, a dream she had been sold rather than a man she had truly known. What she felt was more like the cold, clarifying aftermath of being deceived, a kind of brisk interior whether that stripped away the sentimentality and left her standing in a cleaner, starker landscape. She was not destroyed by it. She was not even, she realized, truly surprised. What she was alone. And that was something she had been before. She knew how to be alone. She was not sure she knew how to be publicly, spectacularly, ceremonially alone in the way she now was. Nathan Lockhart took her father's advice about the Dawson Ranch. She found this out a week after his first visit to the store, when he came back for a new supply of coffee and mentioned, in the matter-of-fact way of a man who does not make a production of his decisions, that he had ridden out to the Dawson place and spoken with old Gerald Dawson and agreed to take on the work of breaking the string of Mustangs that Dawson had brought in from the plains the previous autumn. "You're staying then?" Julia said. She was filling a bag with coffee beans from the large burlap sack behind the counter. "For a while," he said. He was looking at the row of preserved goods on the shelf behind her. "How long does it take to break a string of 12 horses? "Depends on the horses and the man breaking them," she said. "Could be 2 months, could be 4. He seemed satisfied with this answer. He bought his coffee and a tin of peaches and some extra salt, and before he left he turned at the door and said, "I heard about Thomas Hargrove, what he did." She had her back to him, resettling the coffee sack. "The whole county's heard about Thomas Hargrove," she said. "It's not a small place for secrets." "No," he said. "I imagine it's not. I only wanted to say," he paused and she turned around to look at him. He was holding his supplies against his chest with one arm and the other hand was on the door frame, and his expression was careful in the way she was beginning to recognize as characteristic of him, weighing words before he let them out. What he did was a contemptible thing, not just the leaving, the way he did it. That says something about him, not about you. Julia looked at him for a long moment. Most people seem to think it says something about me too, she said. Something about being the kind of woman a man can walk away from. That's a foolish way to read it, Nathan said. Yes, she said, it is, but most people are fools. He looked at her as though she had confirmed something. Good day, Miss Morgan. Good day, Mr. Lockhart. He came to the store twice a week after that, sometimes for supplies and sometimes, it seemed to her, just to spend a few minutes talking across the counter. He was not a demonstrative man. He did not pay her elaborate compliments or bring her flowers in the way of a man pursuing a deliberate courtship. He talked to her the way you talk to a person you find genuinely interesting, about practical things and sometimes about less practical things, about the horses he was breaking out at Dawson's place, about the weather patterns of the Texas spring, about the books she kept on a small shelf behind the counter and read in the quiet afternoon hours when the store was empty. She found out in pieces and over time certain things about him. He was from Kansas originally. His father had been a farmer who had died of influenza when Nathan was 17, leaving him the farm, which he had worked for 3 years before a drought made it impossible, and he had sold it and gone west. He had worked cattle drives, worked as a scout for a surveying party up in Wyoming Territory, worked horses wherever he could find them to work, because horses were what he understood best and what he was best at. He was not a gambling man and not a drinking man and not a man who looked for trouble, though from certain things he said obliquely she gathered he had found it occasionally anyway, as men who spend time in the territory sometimes do. He was, she thought, a profoundly solitary person. Not lonely, there was an important distinction there, one she recognized from her own experience. Solitary in the way of someone who has built a life alone and made their peace with it. It showed in the way he moved and the way he spoke, and the way he could sit in comfortable silence with no apparent need to fill it. She was solitary in the same way, and she thought this was perhaps why she did not find him unnerving the way some women would have a quiet man who watched carefully and said little could be, in the wrong context, rather an unsettling presence. In Nathan, the quality read less as withholding and more as patience. He was patient the way the land was patient. He was waiting for things to come clear. The town, meanwhile, had opinions about Thomas Hargrove and opinions about Julia, and as the weeks went by, developing opinions about the stranger from the Dawson Ranch who came to Morgan's dry goods store with regularity, and was often seen talking to the proprietor's daughter for longer than a man strictly needed to purchase beans and coffee. Mrs. Whitfield had said something to Elias about it, by way of a question. Was that young man Nathan Lockhart a respectable sort? And Elias had said that he seemed to be, and Mrs. Whitfield had said, well, Julia could certainly use some steady company after all she'd been through. Julia, when Elias relayed this conversation with thinly veiled satisfaction, said only, Margaret Whitfield should tend to her own garden. Her garden is immaculate, Elias observed. She has nothing to tend to. Your life is more interesting. My life, Julia said firmly, is not a spectator event. In June, Reverend Calhoun's church held its summer social, which was one of the significant occasions of the Redemption Creek calendar. A Saturday evening affair in the churchyard with tables of food and a fiddle player, and dancing on the packed earth. The kind of event that most of the town attended because it was one of the few entertainments available that did not involve cards or whiskey, and several of the most committed card and whiskey men attended anyway because their wives insisted. Julia went because not going would have been remarked upon, and because she was not, despite everything, a person who hid from her own town. She wore her best everyday dress, a deep blue cotton that suited her, and she did her hair properly, and she went and smiled and talked, and accepted the ongoing sympathies of half the women there and the speculative looks of half the men, who seemed collectively uncertain how to calibrate their behavior toward a woman who had been publicly jilted and had handled it with more dignity than any of them would have managed. Nathan Lockhart was there because Gerald Dawson had come to the social and brought his hands, as he did every year. Julia saw Nathan standing at the edge of the yard, a tin cup of lemonade in his hand, watching the dancing with the expression of a man who is enjoying himself by proximity without any particular desire to participate. She went and stood beside him because it was her town and she was not going to spend the evening hovering anxiously at the edge of groups. "Mr. Lockhart," she said. "Miss Morgan," he looked at her. "You look well." "Thank you." She looked out at the dancers. The fiddle player was working through a reel and several couples were turning through it with varying degrees of skill. "Do you dance?" "Poorly," he said. "That's honest. There's not much point in claiming otherwise since you'd find out as soon as I tried." She turned to look at him. He was watching her with that calm, attentive expression, and there was something in it that she had been aware of for weeks now, a warmth that was more than courtesy, a quality of interest that went beyond what two acquaintances exchanged across a store counter. She had been aware of it and had been careful about what she did with that awareness, because she was 24 and she had just been left at the altar and she was not. She had decided, going to let herself be reckless about what she noticed or what it might mean. "Would you dance with me anyway?" she said. "Poorly or not?" He set his lemonade down on the nearest table without any visible hesitation. "Yes," he said. They danced 3 dances. He was not as poor a dancer as he had claimed. He had a natural sense of rhythm and a solid, sure way of leading that made it easy to follow, even in a reel that required quick footwork. By the 3rd dance the fiddle had slowed to something more like a waltz, and they were closer than they had been in the reel, and Julia was aware of the warmth of his hand at her back, and the way his eyes stayed on her face through the whole of it, not looking around the yard or over her shoulder, the way a man does when he is merely being polite. When the music stopped, he held her hand for a moment longer than was strictly required by the conclusion of a dance, and she let him. "You're better than you said," she told him. "I'm better than I said specifically in this context," he said, with that almost smile at the corner of his mouth that she had become very familiar with over the past weeks. She laughed. It surprised her, the laugh. It came up freely and fully, and she had not expected it to feel so uncomplicated. "Good night, Mr. Lockhart. Good night, Miss Morgan." She walked home in the warm June dark, and she did not allow herself to examine the evening too carefully. But she was aware, as she unlocked the back door of the store and went up to her room, that she felt lighter than she had in 2 months. Summer settled over Redemption Creek with the particular merciless intensity of a West Texas summer, and the days grew long and blinding hot, and the red earth cracked, and the creek dropped to a thin ribbon between its dusty banks. Nathan came to town when he could, which was not as often during the heaviest work of breaking the horses. The mustangs were difficult animals, some of them genuinely dangerous, and the work required a kind of focus and presence that did not leave much room for 2-hour rides into town. But he came when he could, and the visits had changed in character. They were no longer the slightly formal exchanges of 2 people who are being careful with each other. By July they had arrived, without either of them having formally announced it, at a kind of easy familiarity. He called her Julia, she called him Nathan, and they talked the way you talk to someone when you have stopped performing and started being, which is a different quality of conversation altogether. He told her about the horses. She had asked once, genuinely curious, what it was like to break a mustang that had never been touched by human hands, and he had described it in such clear and patient detail. The weeks of slow acclimatization before you ever put a hand on the animal, the moment of first contact, the long process of building trust between a creature designed for flight and a human whose instinct in the face of resistance is to push harder, that she had sat very still and listened to every word of it. And when he finished, she had said, That sounds like it requires an enormous amount of patience. Yes, he had said, and the willingness to be wrong about what the animal needs and to start over. Most people aren't willing to do that, she said. No, he agreed. Most people take it personally when a horse doesn't do what they want. They feel like the horse is defying them deliberately. The horse is just being a horse. Thomas Hargrove's father used to beat his horses when they shied, Julia said. It came out more flatly than she intended. Nathan had looked at her for a moment. That explains some things, he said. She had looked up. About Thomas. About what he thought the world owed him, Nathan said. Men who grow up watching that, the idea that resistance is something to be overcome by force rather than by understanding. It gets into the way they think about more than horses. She had thought about that for a long time after he left. It was on a Thursday in late July, one of the hottest days of the summer, when a man rode into Redemption Creek on a lathered horse and went straight to the sheriff's office. And by evening the news had traveled to every corner of town. There had been a robbery of the Cattle Association payroll up at the crossing north of town, and the ranger company was asking for anyone who might have seen riders passing through in the last 2 days to come forward. This had nothing, in the direct sense, to do with Julia or Nathan. But Nathan, who had ridden into town that morning on the gray horse and had been at the store when the ruckus started, had in fact seen 3 riders passing the turnoff from the Dawson ranch the previous evening, going at a pace that had seemed purposeful and had struck him as worth noting. He went to the sheriff's office and said so, gave a description, and spent 2 hours answering questions from a Texas ranger named Beaumont who had a drooping mustache and the skeptical eyes of a man who has heard a great many stories. Julia had waited in the store not because Nathan had asked her to, but because she found she was not inclined to be elsewhere. When he came out, she was on the sidewalk sweeping the evening dust, and he came and stood beside her and said, 3 men heading north. They'll have them within a day, most likely. Rangers in this district are thorough. Are you in any trouble? She asked. No, he said, looking faintly surprised by the question. I just saw them pass. I wasn't involved in anything. I know that, she said. I only meant I wanted to make sure you were all right. He went quiet for a moment, and she realized it was the kind of quiet that comes over a person when something has landed differently than they expected. He looked at her with that careful, attentive expression, and then he said, I'm all right, Julia. Good, she said, and went back to sweeping, and neither of them said anything more about it, but the air between them had changed in some small and significant way, and she was aware of it all evening. In August, Elias Morgan's health began to trouble him. The rheumatism that had been a manageable inconvenience for the past few years sharpened suddenly into something more serious, and the town doctor, a careful man named Prescott who had studied in Philadelphia before deciding he preferred wide skies, told Elias that he needed to rest his legs and limit his time on his feet for at least 6 to 8 weeks. This presented a practical problem. The store could not run on Julia alone, or rather, it could run but barely, and only if she did not sleep much. The loading and unloading of freight deliveries, the management of the storeroom, the outside work that Elias normally handled, these things required strength and time she did not have in addition to running the floor. She did not ask Nathan for help. She would not have asked him for help. It was not in her nature to ask people for things, and her father's trouble was not Nathan's responsibility. But he heard about it. News of any kind traveled fast in 300 souls, and he appeared at the store on a Saturday morning 2 days after the doctor's visit and said, with the matter-of-fact simplicity that characterized all his more generous acts, that he was not needed at the Dawson Ranch on Saturdays, and he would come to town on those mornings and handle whatever needed handling if she would have him. You don't have to do that, Julia said. I know I don't have to, he said. I want to. She had looked at him for a long time in that morning light. You're not just being charitable, she said. It was not quite a question. No, he said, I am not just being charitable. It was, in its understated way, the clearest declaration either of them had made, and Julia received it in the same understated way it was offered, with a look that acknowledged what had been said and what it meant, and she said, "All right, Nathan. Saturday mornings, then." He came every Saturday. He unloaded the freight and rearranged the storeroom and fixed the loose board on the back step that had been bothering Elias for 3 months. He stayed for dinner, which Julia cooked and which Elias ate in the back room in the comfortable armchair where he spent most of his recovery. And the three of them ate and talked, and it had the quality, those evenings, of something practiced and natural and easy in a way that Julia had not expected anything to feel again so soon. One evening in late August, when Elias had fallen asleep in his chair after dinner and Julia and Nathan were sitting on the back steps with the warm night around them and the stars very close and brilliant in the dry air, Nathan said, "I want to tell you something, and I want to tell it to you straight, and I'm not sure how to start." Julia looked at him. He was looking at the sky, his forearms on his knees, and his profile in the lamplight that came through the back window was serious and a little uncertain, which was a quality she had not seen in him before, and it affected her more than she would have expected. "Start at the beginning," she said. "That usually works." He turned to look at her. "I came here as a stranger passing through," he said. "I didn't come here looking for anything in particular. I'm not a man who makes plans of that kind. I've been moving too long to think much about settling." "I know," she said. "But something happened," he said. "Not all at once, over weeks. I found myself finding reasons to come to town when I didn't strictly need to. I found myself—" He stopped, worked his jaw slightly, finding the words. "I found myself thinking about you when I wasn't here, about what you said the last time and what you might say the next time." Julia's heart was doing something steady and insistent that she was aware of in a way she could not quite ignore. "Nathan," she said. "I'm not trying to rush you," he said. "I know it's only been a few months since. I know the timing is not what anyone would plan. I'm not asking you for anything right now. I want you to know what I'm thinking." Because it felt dishonest to keep coming here without saying it. She was quiet for a moment. The stars were doing their brilliant, uninterested burning above them, the way they did in Texas in August when the air was clear and dry and the night was so big it made your chest ache. "Nathan," she said again, and her voice was quieter now. "I know what you're thinking. I've known for a while." "I thought you might," he said. "And I want you to know," she said, "that I've been doing my own thinking. And I'm not standing in the same place I was in April. I thought I would be. I thought it would take much longer to feel like a person again after what Thomas did. But somehow over this summer she paused. "I've felt like a person, and that's partly you." He looked at her with an expression that was more open than she had ever seen it. "Only partly," he said, and there was something in his voice that was very close to warmth. "Mostly you," she said, and the honesty of it settled between them like something long awaited. He took her hand, which was on the step between them, and held it in both of his, and they sat there in the warm August night for a long time without saying anything, and it was enough. The fall came in with a sudden drop of temperature and the smell of cedar in the air, and the sense of the world shifting its weight from summer to something more serious. The cattle drives that had been moving through all summer thinned out, and the trail dust settled, and Redemption Creek took on the quieter quality of a place settling in for the colder months. Nathan's work at the Dawson Ranch was coming to its natural conclusion. The string of Mustangs had been broken to saddle, and several had already been sold, and Gerald Dawson had indicated that once the last 4 animals were gentled, he would not have work to offer until spring. Nathan had told Julia this in September with the frank openness that he brought to all their serious conversations, and the conversation that followed had been one of the most significant either of them had had. "Will you go north then?" Julia had asked. They had been walking along the creek, which was up to a respectable level again after the August rains, and the cottonwoods along the bank were turning yellow in the early October light. "That depends," Nathan had said. "On what?" He had stopped walking and turned to face her, and the sun was in his eyes, so he was squinting slightly, which gave his expression the quality of a man looking carefully at something important. "On you," he said. Julia had looked at the creek for a moment, at the yellow leaves falling into the brown water and floating away. Then she had looked at him. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "I didn't think you were," he said. "This is your town. Your father is here. Your life is here." He paused. "I'm asking whether there's something here for me." The directness of it made her chest expand. She had spent 8 months with Thomas Hargrove, who had circled around Rio feeling like a man circling a campfire that he was not sure was safe to approach, who had spoken in gestures and implication and made her do the work of interpretation. Nathan was nothing like that. He said what he meant, and he looked at you when he said it, and he waited for a real answer. "Yes," she said, "there is something here for you." He nodded once, in the way of a man receiving information he had hoped for but had not assumed. "Then I'll stay," he said. "Just like that," she said. "Just like that," he said. "A man goes where the reasons are." They walked back from the creek with their shoulders closed together, and the October light on the water behind them. And when they reached the edge of town, he took her hand in the plain, unceremonious way that had become natural to them. And she held it. And they walked down the street together toward the store where Elias was behind the counter reading the weekly paper that came in on the stage from San Antonio. Elias looked up when they came in and looked at their joined hands and at their faces, and something in his expression relaxed in the way that tells you attention has been resolved that you had not entirely acknowledged was there. He folded his paper. "Well," he said, with a tremendous amount of meaning in one syllable. "Papa," Julia said. "Don't tell me not to say anything," Elias said. "I'm not going to say anything. I'm just going to sit here and be satisfied." Nathan shook Elias' hand, which made Elias stand up from his stool, which required some doing given the state of his knees. But he stood up for it, and the two men shook hands with a gravity that was about more than a handshake. And Julia stood beside the counter and watched and felt something in her settle into place. He spoke formally to Elias in November. This was not, in 1879, a mere formality. It was a real conversation, one that Elias took seriously, and that Nathan had clearly thought about carefully. He came to the store on a Sunday morning when it was closed and asked Julia's father with great care and directness whether Elias had any objection to Nathan's intentions toward Julia, and whether, if Julia were willing, Elias would give them his blessing to pursue a proper courtship with a view toward marriage. Elias had been quiet for long enough that Nathan had the experience of understanding what it feels like when a careful man is doing careful work with something important. Then Elias had said, "I've watched you with my daughter for 6 months, Mr. Lockhart. I've watched how you treat her and how you listen to her and how you give her room to be herself, which is not a small thing since Julia Morgan has always been more herself than most people are comfortable with. My answer is yes." Nathan had exhaled, which made Elias smile. "She won't make it easy," Elias added. "No," Nathan said. "I know, I'm counting on that." They courted through the fall and into the winter with the deliberate, unhurried care of two people who were doing this right, because they were both old enough to know the cost of doing it carelessly. They rode together on Sunday afternoons when the weather permitted, Nathan on the gray horse and Julia on the bay mare from the livery stable that she had ridden since she was a girl. They read to each other in the evenings. Nathan, it turned out, was a better reader than he had let on, with a preference for history and the occasional novel that Julia found endearing and told him so. And he had said, with that almost smile, that a man had to have some private qualities or he was transparent as glass. They talked about everything over time, in the way of people building something about money and practicalities, and what kind of life was possible here with a dry goods store, and a man willing to work horses, about children and what kind of parents they hoped to be, about the things they believed and the things they had given up believing, and the things they were still uncertain about. One evening in December, sitting by the stove in the back room of the store while Elias slept down the hall, Nathan said, "I want to ask you something and I want you to be honest with me." "I'm always honest with you," Julia said. "I know you are. That's why I can ask." He was quiet for a moment, turning his tin cup in his hands. "Were you in love with Thomas Hargrove?" She considered the question seriously, because he deserved a serious answer. "I was in love with the idea of what he represented," she said finally. "A house, a future, an ending to the particular loneliness of being a woman without a woman's expected kind of life. I was not in love with the actual man. I think I knew that somewhere, and I was afraid of what it meant about me if I let myself know it." "What did you think it meant about you?" "That I was too practical for love," she said. "That I was the kind of person who approached feeling the way I approached the ledger, looking for what made sense rather than what moved me." Nathan looked at her. And now I know that's not true," she said. He set his cup down and reached across and took her face in both hands, which he had not done before, and kissed her with a gentleness that was also entirely sure of itself. No uncertainty in it, no tentativeness, just the quality of something that has been decided and is being enacted. And she kissed him back with all the feeling she had been carrying since August and probably before that. And when they broke apart, she was slightly breathless, and he was looking at her with an expression that she had never seen on any man's face before, which was the expression of someone who has arrived somewhere they have been traveling toward for a long time. "Julia Morgan," he said, with his hand still framing her face. "Nathan Lockhart," she said. He smiled then, not the almost smile but the real one, the full one which she had seen only a handful of times and which transformed his face entirely, making him look younger and open and completely unguarded. And she thought that smile alone was worth every difficult thing that had gotten her to this room, this evening, this moment. He asked her to marry him on the first day of the new year, 1880, which was a clear and cold January morning with frost on the ground, and the sky a pale bright blue above the flat horizon. He had taken her riding in the early morning, just the two of them and the horses, out past the edge of town, where the land opened up wide and treeless, and the light hit it at a low angle that made everything look sculptural and significant. He had stopped the gray horse and turned to look at her, and she had known from his expression what was coming, and she had felt not the anxious anticipation of a woman waiting for something she was not sure of, but the quiet certainty of a person standing at a door they have already decided to walk through. He said, "I don't have a great deal to offer you in terms of what the world counts as property. I have the horse and my tools and my hands and what I can build with them. I have more faithfulness than I know what to do with, and a very firm intention never to leave you standing somewhere by yourself when you are expecting me to be there." Julia had looked at him for a moment, and then she had laughed, and the laugh went out into the cold, clear morning and scattered. "Was that meant to be a proposal?" she said. "It was working up to one," he said with dignity. "Work faster," she said. "It's cold." "Julia Morgan," he said, and now his voice was very quiet and very sure. "Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, "I will." He reached into the pocket of his coat and brought out a ring, a small gold band with a single garnet, dark red as a coal, which he told her later had been his mother's, brought from Kansas in the lining of his saddlebag for 4 years because he had not been willing to sell it no matter how lean the winters got. He put it on her finger there in the January cold, and it fit as though it had been made for her, and the garnet caught the low winter light and held it. They rode back to town side by side in the bright morning, and Julia wore the ring, and when they came through the door of the store, Elias looked up from his paper and looked at his daughter's face and looked at Nathan Lockhart's face and said, "Thank God," without any ceremony whatsoever, and Nathan shook his hand again, and Elias shook it back with both hands this time. And Julia went and kissed her father's cheek, and he held her for a moment with the quiet fierceness of a man who has been afraid for his daughter and is no longer afraid. They were married in April. Not April the 12th, which had been Thomas Hargrove's day and was now nobody's day in Redemption Creek, but April the 28th, a Thursday, when the bluebonnets and paintbrush were at their finest, and the air was warm without yet being hot. The same church. The same crooked steeple and off-key bell. The same Reverend Calhoun, who was visibly pleased to be conducting a ceremony that had a better chance of being completed than his last attempt. The same pews full of the same 300 souls, but the atmosphere in the building was entirely different from the one Julia had walked into a year before. It was warmer, less formal, infused with the particular electricity of a town that has witnessed something painful and is now watching it resolve into something good. Julia's dress was not the white muslin with pearl buttons. She had given that dress to a woman in town who was getting married in the fall and who needed it and who would make better use of it. And for her own wedding, she wore the deep blue cotton that she had worn to the church social where she and Nathan had first danced, because it was the color of the evening sky, and because it suited her better than white had ever suited her. Her father walked her down the aisle. His legs were better now, the winter rest having done what the doctor promised, and he walked straight and slow and with his jaw set in the same firm, proud way as before, but his eyes were different this time. Last time they had been bright with a pride that had cracks in it, the pride of a man who is doing his best to believe in something. This time they were simply certain. Nathan was at the altar. Of course he was. He was standing exactly where he was supposed to be standing, in his dark coat and a shirt he had bought new in San Antonio. She had sent him with a letter to the dry goods there, because Redemption Creek's selection was limited, and she was particular. And his hat was not on his head because he was in a church. And his hair was neat and his jaw was clean-shaven. And he was looking down the aisle at her with an expression that made every person in that church understand, without any doubt at all, that this was a man who intended to be exactly where he was standing. She walked toward him and he watched her come, and when she reached him he took both her hands in both of his and Reverend Calhoun began to speak, and Julia did not hear the first few sentences of it because she was too busy looking at Nathan's face, at the full real smile that he was giving her freely and openly in front of 300 people and God and the whole April morning. They said the words. They meant the words. Reverend Calhoun asked if anyone had cause to object, which produced a brief charged silence in which no one moved and no one breathed, and then the silence passed, and no one had objected, and Calhoun continued. And when he told Nathan he could kiss his bride, Nathan took Julia's face in both hands the way he had done in December by the stove, and kissed her with the same gentleness and the same certainty. And the church erupted in the kind of noise that happens when a room full of people has been holding its collective breath and can finally let it go. They walked back down the aisle together and out into the April morning, and the sun hit them and the air smelled of bluebonnets, and behind them came the sound of the whole town coming out after them. The reception was in the churchyard. Tables of food, the same fiddle player as the summer social, the same packed earth for dancing. Nathan danced with her again, better than he had claimed in June, and she laughed and he kept his eyes on her face all through it. And the afternoon was warm and long and full of good things. And when it was finally over and the guests had gone and the tables were cleared and the fiddle had gone silent, they walked home together through the blue evening to the store where Elias had gone ahead to rest, and Nathan held her hand, and she held his, and neither of them needed to say anything at all. They built a life in Redemption Creek, which was the kind of town that could sustain a life if you were willing to put your hands to it. Nathan took on work with Gerald Dawson on a permanent basis. Dawson had decided he liked having a man who understood horses and was not going to keep finding reasons to let a good one go, and supplemented this in the first year with whatever work presented itself, because the early months of any new household are lean no matter how carefully you plan. By the second year they had saved enough to add 2 rooms to the back of the store building, which had been Elia's suggestion, and which solved the problem of space, and also the more important problem of proximity. Elias was getting on in years, and his health was manageable but not robust, and having Julia and Nathan near without all 3 of them being on top of each other was the right arrangement. Nathan had built the rooms himself with help from a carpenter in town named Oates, working weekends and evenings through the summer of 1880, and Julia had painted them and furnished them with the careful practicality she brought to everything. It was during the construction of the second room that Nathan found out Julia was expecting their first child. She had told him one evening after dinner, when the day's work was done, and they were sitting in the new first room with its smell of fresh pine and new paint, and she had said it without preface, the way she told him all important things, directly, looking at him, letting the words be what they were. He had been so still for a moment that she had wondered if she had miscalculated his reaction, and then he had looked at her with an expression she had not seen before and could not name, except that it was large and full of something that might have been awe, which was not a quality she had previously associated with Nathan Lockhart, who was the most unsentimental person she knew in the best possible sense. He had taken her hands and looked at her for a very long time without speaking, and then he had said, "Julia," in a voice that was slightly different from his usual voice, and she had squeezed his hands and said, "Yes, Nathan," and that had been sufficient. Their son was born in March of 1881. They named him William Elias Lockhart, William for Nathan's father, Elias for hers, which had made the elder Elias Morgan cry for the first time Julia had ever seen, standing in the doorway of the new back room with his knuckles against his mouth and his eyes full, and she had said, "Papa, come in." And he had come in and held his grandson with the concentration of a man performing the most important task of his life. Nathan held William with the same quality of intense, unhurried attention that he brought to everything. The way he had held horses, the way he had listened to Julia speak, the way he had built the rooms. He sat with the baby in the evenings and talked to him in the low, patient voice that William seemed to find entirely convincing, and Julia watched this from across the room and felt something so large and warm, it was nearly physical, the feeling of a life that had become more than she had planned. Elias improved somewhat over the following year. Not to full health, but to a manageable and dignified version of it that allowed him to work the counter on his good days and to sit in his armchair and supervise on the days when his legs would not cooperate. Nathan had, by this point, become the de facto physical manager of the store, not its owner, not its keeper, but the person who made sure the freight came in and the storeroom was organized and the repairs were done, the practical underpinning of the whole enterprise. And he did this without fanfare or particular credit because he understood, as he had understood from the beginning, that the store was Julia's domain and Julia's inheritance, and he was not there to take that over but to support it. Julia, for her part, expanded the store's inventory in the second and third years of their marriage with a business acumen that was entirely her own. She had always known what Redemption Creek needed better than the men who assumed they knew it, and she began carrying goods that the town had previously ordered by stage from San Antonio, fabric, medicines, better tools, negotiating directly with the merchants in San Antonio by letter with such precision and persistence that she eventually secured prices that made the store considerably more profitable than it had been under her father alone. Elias noticed. He said one evening when they were going over the ledger together, "Your mother would have done this." Julia looked up. Her father spoke of her mother rarely. Would she? She had the same way, Elias said. Looking at what was there and seeing what else was possible, he paused. "I never had the imagination for it. I just held on to what was there." "You held on very well, Papa," Julia said. He smiled. "You built on it, that's better." Nathan, in his third year at the Dawson Ranch, had taken on a partner of sorts in the horse work, a young man named Caldwell who had come up from the Rio Grande Valley and who had a natural gift with animals and a willingness to learn that Nathan respected. They ran the breaking operation together and began, cautiously, to sell horses not just to local ranches, but to the cavalry post 40 miles east, which had a regular need for broken horses and paid reliable prices. It was not a fortune, but it was steady, which in 1882 in West Texas was worth more than a fortune because fortunes fluctuated with cattle prices and weather and the reliability of stages, and steady was the thing you built a life on. In the spring of 1883, their second child came, a daughter this time, and they named her Ruth after Julia's mother. Ruth Lockhart was born on a day in May when the bluebonnets were going to seed, and the fields were turning from blue to green, and she came into the world with Nathan's dark hair and Julia's eyes, and the particular expression of a person who intends to examine everything before accepting it. Nathan had said, holding her the first evening, that she had her mother's look about her already, the one that meant she was deciding whether to grant you her trust, and Julia had said that she hoped Ruth would make people earn it more carefully than her mother had at 24. Nathan had looked at her across the sleeping baby with a full smile. At 24, your mother was doing just fine, he said. She was left at the altar, Julia said, with the ease of a woman who can speak of the worst morning of her life because enough good mornings have followed to balance the account. And what happened after? Nathan said. A stranger stepped forward, Julia said. That's a good story, he said. Yes, she agreed. It is. Thomas Hargrove had come back to Redemption Creek once, in the autumn of 1881, which was 2.5 years after the wedding he had not attended. He had come alone. The Delacourt woman from Cedar Falls had, according to the information that filtered back to Redemption Creek over the preceding months, left him after less than a year in Abilene, taking her grandmother's money with her. He had looked, when he rode into town, older and more angular, as though something had been worn off him. Julia had been behind the counter of the store when he came in, and the first thing she felt when she saw him was a flat, clear absence of feeling that told her everything she needed to know about where she stood. Not bitterness. Bitterness implies something unresolved, and this was entirely resolved. Just the recognition of a man she had once confused for what she wanted and now understood, clearly and without drama, she had not wanted at all. He had stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the changes to the store, the expanded inventory, the new shelving Nathan had built along the back wall, the child's drawing pinned above the counter that William had produced at age 2.5 with great seriousness, and which Julia had framed in a small piece of pine. Then he had looked at her. Julia, he said. Thomas, she said, what can I do for you? He had wanted to talk, and she had let him talk, because she was not a cruel person and he had clearly come to say something and it had cost him something to come, and she could afford to be generous from the position she was in, which was a very strong one. He had said he was sorry, and she had looked at him and believed him and said so, and she had also said, in the quiet and direct way she said things, that she hoped he would build something better than what he had abandoned here, because what he had abandoned had turned out, unexpectedly, to be the best thing that had ever happened to her. He had left. She had not told Nathan about the visit until later that evening because there was nothing urgent to tell, and she did not feel that Thomas Hargrove had any claim on her attention that required interrupting the ordinary business of the day. When she told Nathan, he had listened without visible reaction and then said, "How did it feel?" "Like nothing," she said, which was interesting. "Good interesting or unsettling interesting?" "Good," she said. "Very good, like a bill that has been settled." He had nodded. "Good," he said, and that had been the end of Thomas Hargrove in their lives. Elias Morgan died in the winter of 1884. He died in the way he had lived steadily, without drama, in his armchair with a lamp burning and his paper in his hands and his glasses on his nose, and Julia found him when she brought in his evening tea, and he was simply very still. The doctor said his heart had stopped cleanly, no struggle, and Julia held this fact carefully in the difficult weeks that followed. They buried him in the Redemption Creek Cemetery on a cold February day with the whole town present, because Elias Morgan had been a part of this town for 30 years and 300 people knew what that meant. Nathan stood beside Julia through all of it with his shoulder against hers and his hand in the small of her back, solid and present in the way she had come to depend on, and she did not allow herself to fall apart publicly, but she held onto his arm when they walked back from the grave, and she let herself lean against his chest that evening in the lamplight of the store, and he held her without trying to speak over the grief, which was exactly right. She inherited the store, as had always been understood. She also inherited her father's considerable record of good standing in the town, which was not a financial asset but was not nothing. Elias Morgan had been trusted, and the trust passed to his daughter as easily as the building and the inventory, because the town had watched Julia Morgan grow from a girl behind a counter to a woman who ran the counter, and they knew what they were getting. Nathan came off the Dawson Ranch the spring after Elias died. The horse operation he and Caldwell had been running was now generating enough income that he did not need the Dawson work as a primary income, and the store required his full attention in ways that it had not while Elias was alive. He became, formally and officially, co-proprietor of Morgan's Dry Goods, which they debated briefly whether to rename and decided not to, because the name was the reputation, and the reputation was worth keeping. He also, in the months after Elias' death, became the thing that Julia had not known she needed until it was there. Not just a husband, not just a business partner, but the particular kind of person who sits across from you at the breakfast table in the ordinary morning and knows you completely, your history and your stubbornness and your fears and your private jokes and your silences, and loves all of it, not despite any of it, but because all of it is you. She had not known that this was what love was. She had thought love was the feeling of being chosen in spite of yourself, the relief of being found acceptable. She understood now that it was something else entirely. It was being known and being held in the knowing. It was Nathan Lockhart looking at her across the breakfast table on a Tuesday morning, with nothing particular happening, and his eyes warm and his coffee in his hand, and the quiet, easy certainty between them that this was the place, and this was the person, and everything was exactly right. Their third child was born in 1885. Another boy, a sturdy, fair-haired child who had Nathan's jaw and Elias' eyes, and who they named James after nobody in particular, which they thought was freeing in its own way. James was an easy baby and a loud toddler, and was 3 years old before he let his mother put him down without immediate protest, which Nathan found deeply amusing, and which Julia said made sense because James had decided Nathan was the most interesting person in any room and was not going to be separated from him by something as unconvincing as gravity. The town of Redemption Creek grew in the 1880s. The cattle trails changed their routes as the ranches further south expanded and the railheads moved, and the town adapted, adding a bank and a second saloon and a telegraph office, and a school that was better than the old one. Julia served on the committee that established the new school, which was the first time a woman had served on such a committee in Redemption Creek, and she had gotten there not by asking permission, but by showing up at the first meeting and sitting down and being more prepared than anyone else in the room, and nobody had asked her to leave because her preparation was too useful to waste. Nathan had watched this from a distance with the full smile, and when she came home from the first meeting he had asked how it had gone, and she had said, "They had not done their arithmetic. I did it for them," and he had laughed the real laugh, which was rare and full, and which William and Ruth had already learned to pursue like a prize. In 1886, on a warm September evening, Nathan and Julia were sitting on the back steps of the store, not the old steps, which had been replaced twice by now, but the same spot, the one where they had sat in August of 1879, and he had taken her hand for the first time, and they had not talked about it directly but had understood each other perfectly. The children were inside, the 2 older ones in bed and James nearly there. The night was warm and the stars were brilliant. Nathan said, "Do you remember what you said to me on the church steps?" Julia leaned her head against his shoulder. "I said a number of things. You said there was nowhere in Redemption Creek you could go where that morning wouldn't follow you." She was quiet for a moment. "I remember." Does it still follow you? She considered this honestly, the way she considered all things he asked her honestly. Not the way it used to, she said. The shape of it is still there somewhere. The way a healed bone is still where the break was, but it doesn't hurt. And it doesn't follow, it's just part of the geography. He pressed his lips against the top of her head. I'm glad. It led me here, she said, so I find I don't resent it the way I expected to. He put his arm around her, and she settled against his side in the warm September dark. And Redemption Creek was quiet around them, and their children were inside. And the stars were doing their brilliant, useless burning overhead. And Julia Lockhart, felt the extraordinary, ordinary completeness of a life that had arrived exactly where it was supposed to be through a path she would never have chosen and could not have imagined. She thought about the woman she had been on the church steps in April of 1879. The white dress and the wildflowers and the composed face and the burning coal of humiliation held steady behind her eyes. She thought about how alone that woman had been, not just in that moment but in all the ways that preceded it, the careful solitary competence, the ledgers and the measuring and the building of walls designed to look like floors. She thought about the stranger with the gray horse who had looked at her without pity and said things that were true and precise, and had not tried to smooth over what was difficult. She thought about the moment. She had not told Nathan this and never would because some things were private, when she had first understood that she was in love with him. It had not been a dramatic moment. It had been a Tuesday afternoon in July when he had come into the store and she had been at the counter entering numbers in the ledger and he had come up behind the counter, which he did now because he was trusted to, and he had said her name and she had looked up and he was close and he was looking at her with that careful, warm, attentive expression, and something in her chest had simply said yes, the way a compass says north. Not a question, not a wish, just a recognition. She had gone back to the ledger and finished the numbers before she let herself think about it further, because she was Julia Morgan and that was how she operated. But the yes had stayed, and it had never unsaid itself, and it was still there now, 7 years later with his arm around her, and the warm night around them, and the full life around her like a country she had never expected to find and could not now imagine living without. She thought about what he had said on the church steps, that first day. She had been wearing her wedding dress and carrying flowers that had started to wilt in the heat, and she had told him there was nowhere she could go where that morning wouldn't follow her, and he had said, "That's a fair point," and stayed anyway. That was everything, she thought. That's a fair point, and I'm staying anyway. There was a fourth child, eventually, another daughter born in 1888, the spring before Julia turned 33 and Nathan turned 37. And they named her Clara, and she arrived during a thunderstorm that swept in from the southwest and rattled every window in the store building, which Nathan said was fitting since Clara had apparently decided she was going to make an entrance. Clara had her mother's green eyes and her father's dark hair, and she was born stubborn and opinionated in a way that made Elia's name seem appropriate even though he was gone, because the stubbornness was clearly a family inheritance. By then William was 8 and Ruth was 6 and James was 4, and the house that had been added onto the store building had expanded twice more to accommodate them all, and Nathan had built a small corral behind the building where he kept a pair of horses, because a man in his business could not be without horses, and because William was already showing the same natural ease around them that his father had, which Nathan received with a quiet pride that Julia found almost unbearable in the best way. Ruth, the eldest daughter, had her mother's way with numbers and her father's patience, and she spent her afternoons at the store counter with a speed and precision that made Julia say one evening, watching her, that Elias would have been beside himself. The store continued to grow. By 1890, it was the largest and most profitable dry goods establishment in the county, which had required a great deal of steady work and careful decisions, and the willingness to adapt as the territory changed. As the railroad came closer and the cattle business shifted, and the town's population grew, and the needs of that population changed with it. Julia navigated all of this with the same competence she brought to everything, and Nathan supported all of it with the same steady, non-possessive practical backing that had characterized everything he did. They had their arguments, because all people living closely together have their arguments, and Julia was not a woman who swallowed things, and Nathan was not a man who let things sit unanswered. They argued with the full-blooded directness of two people who trust each other enough to say the difficult thing and know the other person will still be there afterward. The arguments were real and sometimes sharp and were always over by the next morning, because they had both made a decision, early and consciously, that they would not let things fester, and they held to this decision with the same discipline they held to their other important commitments. On the occasion of their 10th anniversary, in April of 1890, Nathan surprised her. He was not a man who went in for elaborate gestures. His gifts were the everyday kind, the noticing and the listening and the being there. But on the morning of April the 28th, he came into the store before she was behind the counter and produced from his coat pocket a small parcel wrapped in brown paper, and she opened it to find a book. A new novel from back east that she had mentioned wanting to read 3 months before, and then said no more about, because it was a small thing and there were always more pressing things. He had remembered and had written away for it, and it had come in on the stage the previous week while she was busy, and he had kept it in the top drawer of the bureau where she never went. She had held the book for a long moment. Then she had looked up at him, and he was watching her with the full smile already in place, and she had set the book down carefully on the counter and walked around it and taken his face in her hands the way he had taken hers, 100 times, the gesture that was theirs, and kissed him, and he had kissed her back, and it was 10 years and 4 children and a store and a life, and it was all right there in the kiss, everything they had built. "Happy anniversary," he said, against her mouth. "Happy anniversary," she said. The children came clattering in from breakfast at that moment, all 4 of them. William at 10, the most restrained about walking into rooms where his parents were standing close together, and James at 5 the least, who said, "What are you doing?" With the full candor of 5 years old, and Nathan pulled back and laughed and said, "Talking to your mother." And Julia smoothed her hair and said, "James, go wash your hands." And the morning began. Redemption Creek grew and changed through the 1890s, and the Lockharts grew and changed with it. The children went to school and came home and grew up in the graduated, distinct way of children, each into their own particular person, and the store remained the center of things, and the back rooms of the store building remained home, and the gray horse, old now, soft around the muzzle and white above the eyes, lived in the small corral behind the building, and was taken on gentle rides by children and grandchildren in due time. But that is ahead, and the story is really here, in the years that built to that future, in the daily substance of a life that was neither simple nor perfect, but was solid and real and rooted in something genuine. It was in the Tuesday mornings, and the arguments and the reconciliations and the evenings on the back steps, and the children sleeping in their rooms and the ledgers and the horses, and the store that smelled of coffee and cedar, and the particular Texas dust that never quite settled. It was in the fact that a woman had walked out of a church in April of 1879 with nothing but her pride and a handful of wilting bluebonnets, and a stranger had been standing at the bottom of the steps with a gray horse and a way of looking at her that was neither pity nor dismissal, and he had stayed, and she had let him stay, and everything that came after was the consequence of that staying. Julia Lockhart, née Morgan, at 35 and 40 and 50, still had the wedding ring with the garnet, his mother's ring, brought across Kansas in a saddlebag on her left hand. She wore it without thought, the way you wear something that has become part of your body. But occasionally, in the quiet of an evening or the early morning when the light came through the window at a particular angle, she would notice it and remember. She would remember the church steps and the hot April sun, and the absolute necessity of keeping her face composed and her chin level. And she would remember the sound of boots on the packed earth and the gray horse nosing at the dry grass, and the voice that had said things that were true and precise, and had not tried to make the difficult thing easier than it was. And she would think, as she always thought in these moments, that the worst morning of her life had been the one that brought her to the best thing in it. She would look across whatever room she was in, and Nathan Lockhart would be there at the counter or the stove or the corral fence, with a child on one arm or a cup of coffee in his hand, or simply standing in the ordinary way of a man who is at home in his own life. And he would look up, because he always seemed to know when she was looking at him, and he would give her the full smile, and she would give it back. And that was enough. That had always been enough. It had been enough from the first day, when he had stood at the bottom of the church steps and looked at a woman with nothing but her pride and decided, in the quiet, unhurried way of a man who knows his own mind, that her pride was a fine and sufficient thing, and he would like very much to know the rest of her. It was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was everything.